What does it mean to squeeze the trigger and watch a line of men collapse in seconds? MG42 gunners in World War II didn't have to imagine it. They lived it. The moment they opened fire, their location was instantly revealed, and the fury of the battlefield shifted directly onto them. But that wasn't even the hardest part. Beyond the constant risk of death and the horror of what their weapon did to human bodies, there were darker orders, tasks machine gunners were given that would scar them for life. We'll come back to one of those haunting stories later. Today we're diving into the real experience of the men behind the infamous MG42, how they fought, how the weapon was used, and why being its operator was a burden far heavier than carrying a standard rifle. Of all the weapons deployed during the Second World War, few etched themselves into memory like the MG42. Allied soldiers often mocked German weapons with derisive nicknames, making them sound less threatening. But the MG42 was different. Its name, Hitler's buzzsaw, was no joke. It came from the gun's staggering rate of fire, a sound that was unmistakable and terrifying. The weapon spat out nearly 1,200 rounds every minute, 20 bullets per second. It was so fast that instead of the familiar stutter of a machine gun, what you heard was a single unbroken roar, like the tearing of fabric. To those on the receiving end, it was the sound of death itself. But how did the German army end up with such an advanced weapon for its time? The MG42 wasn't their first step. After the Treaty of Versailles banned Germany from developing heavy weapons, the country spent the 1930s quietly ignoring restrictions, secretly rebuilding its military might. The machine guns they had carried over from the First World War, the MG08, were relics. Water-cooled, massive, weighing over 40 kilograms, they belonged to the age of trench warfare, not the lightning-fast blitzkrieg campaigns the Nazis envisioned. So engineers sought lighter, more mobile solutions. In 1930, they produced the MG13. Air-cooled, portable, but flawed, with a tiny 25-round magazine that emptied in barely 2 seconds. Then came the MG34 in 1934, a revolutionary design. Belt-fed, accurate, versatile, with a quick-change barrel, it could serve on a bipod, a tripod, vehicles, even aircraft. It was the world's first true general-purpose machine gun, a blueprint every modern army would later follow. Yet, despite its brilliance, the MG34 had fatal drawbacks. It was complex, costly, and fragile under battlefield conditions like mud, dust, or freezing cold. Building just one required 150 hours of labor. Soldiers had to constantly oil, clean, and tend to it just to keep it functioning. For a peacetime army, it was excellent. For a world war demanding mass production, it was impractical. The German High Command demanded a replacement, something tougher, cheaper, and faster to build. The result was the MG42. Using stamped steel parts, it could be manufactured in half the time of its predecessor, and at far less cost. It proved more durable in the field, easier to handle, and even deadlier with its blistering rate of fire. By the war's end, over 400,000 MG42s had been produced, and its legacy endures. With only minor changes, its descendant, the MG3, remains in service today across multiple armies, still firing, still feared. A weapon born in the fires of World War II that never truly left the battlefield. What made the MG42 such a nightmare for Allied troops wasn't only its terrifying speed of fire, it was how the Germans used it. Their entire infantry doctrine revolved around the machine gun. In a German squad, the riflemen didn't exist to be the main fighters. They existed to serve the gun. The squad's firepower, its survival, its purpose, all centered on that weapon. Each unit consisted of 10 men. At the heart of it was the 3-man machine gun crew. The gunner carried the MG34 or MG42 itself, with a 50-round drum clipped on and only a sidearm as a backup. Right beside him, the assistant gunner kept the weapon alive, feeding belts, swapping barrels, clearing jams. He carried spare drums, a 300-round ammo box, and usually nothing more than a pistol. And if the gunner was hit, there was no hesitation. The assistant dropped everything and took his place. The weapon had to stay firing no matter what. Behind them, the ammo carrier hauled more 300-round boxes and a carbine, staggering under the weight. Together, the crew dragged nearly 1,800 rounds into battle. The rest of the squad, 5 riflemen and a squad leader, their main task simple: shield the gun team. In an assault, they moved forward while the machine gun pinned the enemy down. In defense, they guarded the flanks and made sure nothing reached the crew. But being the centerpiece of the squad meant being the most obvious target. Everyone on the opposing side knew where the true danger was, and it wasn't hard to find because When a weapon spits 20 rounds a second, the roar gives away your position instantly. Snipers, artillery, mortars, even tanks. All eyes went straight to the gunner. For both sides, the MG42 was pure terror. Firing it or facing it, the experience could break a man. The barrel had to be changed every 250 rounds to prevent it from melting. A skilled team could swap it in seconds, but those seconds were an opening. Allied soldiers were trained to charge during that pause, praying they reached the crew before the thunder resumed. For them, it was a race against death. For the gunners, it was a nightmare knowing that enemies would rush the moment they stopped firing. On a bipod, it was a portable killer, fired prone from the hip, or even braced on the assistant's shoulder. On a tripod, however, it became something else entirely. The Lafette 42 mount had a mechanical system that swept the weapon in precise arcs, as if it were mowing down the battlefield by itself. With optics attached, and even the option to fire remotely by pulling a cord, it turned the MG42 into a long-range scythe of staggering accuracy. In defense, it was devastating. And then there was the human cost, not for those facing the weapon, but for those pulling the trigger. A regular infantryman with a bolt-action rifle might fire a handful of shots in a firefight. A machine gunner burned through thousands. They were the wall holding back entire attacks, often alone, over and over again. On D-Day at Omaha Beach, German gunners poured thousands of rounds into the waves of soldiers storming ashore. Some veterans admitted to cutting down hundreds of men in a single day. The images of what they had done never left them. On the Eastern Front, the horror multiplied. Soviet human wave assaults sometimes lasted for hours, smashing themselves against German positions while the machine gunners never stopped firing. Many of them emerged shattered, mentally destroyed, some collapsing into breakdowns after battles, unable to comprehend the sheer scale of death they had inflicted. The MG42 wasn't just a weapon of steel. For the men behind it, it became a curse, a burden that scarred them for life. As horrifying as battlefield combat was, at least there you faced armed opponents. What haunted many MG42 gunners even more were the missions that had nothing to do with fighting enemy soldiers. In occupied territories, machine gun crews were often reassigned to so-called security operations, a sterile term masking what they truly were: brutal reprisals meant to crush resistance and terrify civilians into submission. Directives in some regions were chillingly clear. For every German soldier killed by partisans, 100 civilians would be executed. For every wounded soldier, 50. And the weapon chosen for maximum fear was almost always the machine gun. For the men ordered to carry it out, the horror was unbearable. Imagine being a soldier hardened by combat, prepared to face men shooting back at you. It is savage, but at least there is a grim sense of fairness in that fight. Then one day, your commander orders you to aim into a crowd of unarmed civilians dragged from their homes, guilty of nothing except being in the wrong place at the wrong time. There were occasions when the quota rose into the thousands, with machine gunners firing for hours, mowing down masses of helpless people. Those who carried out such orders were never the same again. The psychological scars from those days often cut deeper than any wound taken in combat. As the war dragged on, the Allies began seizing MG42s and shipping them home for study. The Americans even tried to create their own copy, the T-24, but they could never quite replicate the perfection of the German design. The original remained unmatched, and nearly a century later, the MG42's legacy is still alive. Its direct descendant, the MG3, is standard issue in NATO armies around the globe today, a chilling reminder that this weapon, born in one of history's darkest wars, has outlived the very empire that forged it. If stories like these intrigue you, make sure to subscribe, because we're only just getting started.